I did not scream when I walked into my kitchen and found them at my solid oak table, sipping my bourbon and pushing fraudulent mortgage papers toward my sobbing sister. I did not lose my mind when her father-in-law looked me in the eye and ordered me out of my own house because it was a family matter. I do not waste time on loud tantrums. Give me 24 hours, and I will engineer absolute, unrecoverable destruction. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. My name is Everly Martinez. I am 34 years old, and I work as the lead data investigator at Aegis Nexus Solutions. In my line of work, I hunt down financial discrepancies, corporate espionage, and high-level fraud. I spend my days analyzing risk, dissecting lies, and destroying the carefully constructed illusions of very arrogant people. Because of the intense nature of my career, my home is my sanctuary. It is a sprawling 50-acre smart estate located in the quiet, wealthy suburbs of Austin, Texas. I designed every inch of this property to be a fortress of peace, logic, and order. I was supposed to be in London for another 48 hours. However, after wrapping up my investigation early, I caught a red-eye flight back to Texas, craving nothing more than a hot shower and the absolute silence of my own house. But the moment I unlocked the front door, I knew the silence had been breached. There was a strange, suffocating energy in the air. I walked quietly down the vaulted hallway toward the kitchen, my footsteps muffled by the thick Persian runners. As I turned the corner, the scene that greeted me made the temperature in my veins drop to freezing. My younger sister, Maya, was slumped over my solid oak kitchen island. Her face was buried in her arms, and she was crying so hard her entire body shook with violent, breathless sobs. Standing a few feet away from her was her husband, Julian. He was staring intensely at the floorboards, his shoulders slumped, refusing to make eye contact with his own weeping wife. He looked like a beaten dog, pathetic and useless. And then there were the parasites. Arthur and Eleanor Sterling, Julian's parents, were sitting at my dining table. They were not comforting Maya. They were not asking what was wrong. Instead, Arthur was casually sipping from a glass of my most expensive aged bourbon, while Eleanor inspected her manicured fingernails with an air of profound boredom. They were lounging in my home, breathing my air, and acting with the absolute brazen entitlement of royalty inspecting their newly conquered lands. My eyes did not linger on their smug faces. As a data investigator, I am trained to look for the source of the anomaly. My gaze immediately snapped to the thick stack of legal documents spread out across the polished wood of the kitchen island, right next to Maya's trembling hands. Even from a distance, I recognized the standardized formatting. There were blank power of attorney declaration forms, but what truly made my jaw clench were the documents beneath them. They were cross-collateralization mortgage agreements. My eyes quickly scanned the top paragraph. The property listed on the collateral schedule was not some random townhouse. It was the exact address of my 50-acre estate. They were trying to force Maya to sign away my property to secure a loan. I set my leather travel bag down on the floor. The sound was soft, but in that tense room, it cracked like a whip. Julian flinched. Maya gasped and looked up, her eyes red and swollen. Arthur Sterling simply paused with his glass halfway to his mouth. He slowly turned his head to look at me, showing zero remorse, zero embarrassment, and absolutely zero fear. "What exactly is going on here?" I asked. My voice was not loud. It was low, flat, and completely devoid of emotion. Arthur scoffed. He set the crystal glass down on the oak table with a heavy thud, leaned back in my chair, and gave me a dismissive, aristocratic wave of his hand. "This is a family matter," Arthur stated, his tone dripping with condescension. "You do not need to interfere. We are simply handling some internal financial restructuring." A normal person would have started screaming. A normal person would have grabbed the bourbon bottle and smashed it, or called the police to report a home invasion. But I am not a normal person. I do not waste time on noisy, unproductive rage. Looking at Maya's terrified, trapped expression, the data points instantly connected in my mind. She was not signing these papers willingly. Julian's cowardly silence and Arthur's supreme arrogance meant one thing: Maya was being manipulated. They had her cornered using some form of vicious blackmail. And if I threw them out right now, they would just drag my sister away to a place where I could not protect her. I needed leverage. I needed every single word out of their mouths preserved as undeniable proof. The corners of my mouth twitched upward into a cold, faint smile. I nodded slowly. "I understand," I said softly, keeping my posture entirely unthreatening. "If it is a private family discussion, I will step out to give you all some space to finish up." Arthur smirked, clearly believing he had successfully intimidated a silly woman in her own home. Eleanor finally looked up, giving me a sickly sweet, approving nod. I turned my back on them and walked out of the kitchen. I did not go to the front door. I went straight into the hidden utility corridor that housed my server racks. My fingers danced across the biometric control panel on the wall. With a single command, I overrode the home's passive monitoring and activated the active defense grid. Dozens of hidden security cameras, boasting flawless 4K resolution, silently powered on. They were perfectly concealed inside the smoke detectors, the smart thermostats, and the recessed lighting fixtures above the kitchen island. Simultaneously, the high-fidelity audio receivers booted up, ready to capture every whisper, every threat, and the scratch of every pen on paper. Exactly 60 seconds later, I walked back into the kitchen. Arthur was impatiently tapping a silver pen against the mortgage contract, trying to shove it into Maya's hand. I did not say a word to him. I marched straight to the island, grabbed Maya by her wrist, and hauled her to her feet. "We are going upstairs," I announced, my voice cutting through the room like a steel blade. "You two can wait down here." Before Arthur could protest, before Eleanor could open her mouth to squawk about disrespect, I dragged my sister out of the room and straight up the grand spiral staircase. I left the Sterling sitting in the sprawling silence of the first floor. As I locked the reinforced door of my upstairs office behind us, my smartwatch vibrated against my wrist. It was an automated notification. Every second of video and every syllable of audio from the kitchen was now securely backing up in real time to my encrypted offshore servers. The intruders thought they had claimed my home, but they had just locked themselves inside my trap. Inside my soundproof sanctuary, the heavy oak door clicked shut, instantly severing us from the toxic air downstairs. Maya collapsed onto my leather sofa, her small frame curling into a tight ball. For several minutes, the only sound in the room was her ragged breathing. I sat beside her, gently stroking her hair, waiting for the panic to subside. I did not push. I let the absolute security of the room do its work. Finally, Maya took a shuddering breath and began to speak. The words tumbled out of her in a broken, exhausted stream, painting a picture of systemic, calculated abuse that made my blood run cold. The Sterling family's so-called luxury real estate empire, the foundation of their insufferable arrogance, was completely hollow. According to Maya, they had been secretly teetering on the edge of total bankruptcy for over 18 months. Their recent development projects were catastrophic failures. Bleeding cash they did not have. To maintain their lavish country club lifestyle and keep up appearances, they needed a continuous influx of capital. That was when they turned to their own family. Maya choked on a sob as she confessed that Julian, the man who had promised to protect her, had systematically drained her personal savings accounts. Every dime she had earned from her graphic design business, over $150,000, was gone. He had forged her signature on withdrawal slips and wire transfers, funneling her hard-earned money directly into his parents' failing shell companies. "When I found out last week," Maya whispered, her voice hoarse, "I told Julian I was leaving him. I told him I was going to the police." She squeezed her eyes shut, fresh tears spilling over her cheeks. That was when Arthur and Eleanor stepped in, revealing the true depths of their depravity. They did not apologize. Instead, they sprang a meticulously planned trap. Over the past year, they had appointed Maya as the chief financial officer of 3 dummy corporations without her knowledge. They had forged her electronic signature on dozens of tax returns and fraudulent loan applications. "Arthur cornered me," she cried, gripping my arm. "He said if I tried to leave, or if I reported Julian, he would send a dossier to the authorities. He said he had a team of lawyers ready to testify that I was the mastermind behind the missing funds. I would go to federal prison for 20 years. But he offered me a way out. If I just signed the power of attorney to use your estate as collateral for one massive bailout loan, they would dissolve the dummy corporations and let me walk away quietly." I looked down at the crumpled pieces of paper Maya had instinctively clutched in her hand when I pulled her away from the kitchen island. I gently pried them from her trembling fingers and spread them out on my glass desk. They were copies of the primary loan agreement. As a risk analyst, I spend my life reading contracts. These documents were a terrifying mix of sloppy drafting and breathtakingly brazen criminality. The clauses were arrogant, assuming the reader would be too intimidated to question the legality of the cross-collateralization. But what caught my immediate attention was the name of the underwriting broker stamped at the bottom of the last page. I picked up my phone and dialed a secure line. It rang twice before a deep voice answered. "Everly, to what do I owe the pleasure?" Dominic asked. Dominic was an old university friend who was now a federal prosecutor specializing in high-level financial crimes. We had collaborated on several massive corporate fraud cases in the past. "Dominic, I need a quick favor," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I am looking at a private lending contract. I need you to run a name for me. The underwriter is listed as Silas Thorne." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. The casual warmth in Dominic's voice vanished instantly, replaced by the sharp, clinical tone of a federal agent on the hunt. "Where the hell did you find a document with Silas Thorne's signature on it?" Dominic demanded. "Thorne is not just a sketchy broker. Everly, he is a ghost. We have been trying to pin him down for 3 years. He launders money for offshore syndicates by issuing predatory loans against high-value domestic real estate. If his name is on that paper, whoever is pushing it is heavily involved in a federal racketeering and wire fraud conspiracy. Tell me you are not involved in this." "I am not," I replied, my eyes locked on the paperwork. "But someone is currently sitting in my kitchen, trying to force my sister to sign my house over to him through extortion." "Do not let her sign anything," Dominic ordered, his voice echoing in the quiet office. "This just escalated way beyond a domestic dispute. This is a federal crime scene. If you have evidence of extortion tied to Thorne, I can get a task force mobilized by the end of the week." "I have the evidence," I said softly, glancing at the blinking light on my server rack that confirmed the continuous recording from the kitchen downstairs. "I will call you back when the package is ready." I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the desk. I walked back over to the sofa and knelt in front of my sister. She was watching me with wide, terrified eyes, still trapped in the nightmare Arthur and Eleanor had built around her. I reached out and gently wiped the tears from her pale cheeks. I pulled her into a tight, fierce embrace, letting her feel the solid, unwavering strength of my presence. "You are safe now," I whispered fiercely into her ear. "You are not going to prison, and they are not getting a single dime. We are not just going to stop them from making you sign those papers. Maya, I am going to rip their entire pathetic empire out by the roots. By the time I'm finished with Arthur and Eleanor Sterling, they will beg for bankruptcy." I needed the parasites out of my house, but I needed them to leave with the absolute certainty that they had won. A cornered animal will fight unpredictably, but a predator who believes their prey has surrendered will become sloppy, arrogant, and blind to the trap closing around them. I pulled out my phone and composed a text message to Eleanor. I carefully crafted my digital persona, adopting the tone of a frantic, deeply concerned older sister who was completely out of her depth. I typed that Maya was entirely hysterical and that I needed 48 hours to review the collateral terms privately with her. I added that I desperately wanted to help save her marriage to Julian, but I needed just a little time to make her understand the situation. I pressed send. The response came less than 2 minutes later. I could almost picture Eleanor sitting in her luxury car in my driveway, smiling with malicious triumph as she typed. Her message was a masterpiece of condescending manipulation. She told me that Maya was acting like a spoiled child. She wrote that women must learn to make sacrifices for the men in their lives, and that a good wife understands that her husband's financial legacy is her only true priority. She concluded by granting me until Friday morning to get my sister in line, warning me not to disappoint the family. I took a screenshot of the message. It was a beautiful piece of evidence establishing premeditated psychological coercion. A moment later, the security cameras confirmed their vehicle finally rolling out of my estate. The quiet returned. But it was no longer a peaceful silence. It was the heavy, breathless quiet of a hunter settling into a blind. I left Maya resting in the guest suite and descended into the basement, entering the secure server room that connected directly to the Aegis Nexus Solutions mainframe. The ambient temperature dropped instantly, the hum of the cooling units masking the rapid clicking of my keyboard. I had 72 hours until Friday. I was going to use every single second to dissect the Sterling family down to their very marrow. I initiated a deep digital forensic audit, deploying proprietary algorithmic scrapers designed to hunt down hidden assets and shell corporations. I started with the 3 dummy companies Arthur had fraudulently registered under Maya's name. They were poorly constructed, designed only to catch the overflow of toxic debt from his primary real estate holdings. But once I breached their digital firewalls, I found the routing numbers for their parent accounts. For the next 10 hours, I followed the digital blood trail. The Sterling's entire empire was a breathtaking illusion. They had not turned a legitimate profit in nearly 7 years. Instead, they were running a sophisticated shell game, moving non-existent capital between offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Cyprus to create the appearance of liquidity. They owed millions of dollars to federal tax agencies, private contractors, and ruthless private equity firms. But as the Aegis Nexus supercomputer cross-referenced Arthur's historical banking data, a red warning banner flashed across my screen. The predictive risk model had identified a repeating structural anomaly. I stopped typing. I leaned closer to the monitors, my eyes scanning the heavily encrypted ledgers. This was not the first time they had executed this exact financial maneuver. I ran a deep background check on Julian's romantic history. He played the part of the devoted, sensitive son so well, but the data revealed his true role in the family business. Julian was the honeypot. 5 years ago, Julian was engaged to a woman named Chloe. Her family owned a highly successful, multi-generational logistics company. 6 months before the wedding, Chloe's father mysteriously co-signed a catastrophic private loan to save a failing Sterling development project. 90 days later, the loan defaulted. The underwriter who seized the logistics company was Silas Thorne. Chloe's family was pushed into total bankruptcy, and Julian broke off the engagement a week later, claiming the financial stress had ruined their romance. I dug further. 3 years ago, there was another fiancée. Her name was Sarah. She was the sole beneficiary of her grandfather's massive trust fund. The pattern repeated with terrifying precision: a sudden family financial crisis, a desperate plea from Julian, and a fraudulent transfer of assets to Arthur's shell companies. Sarah lost everything. The Sterlings were not just desperate business owners making a terrible mistake. They were financial serial killers. They targeted successful, emotionally vulnerable women, used Julian to secure their absolute trust, and then leveraged that devotion to bleed their families dry. Maya was simply victim number 3, and I was their biggest target yet. The sheer scale of their predatory cruelty extinguished any lingering trace of mercy in my heart. The following evening, Maya and I were sitting in my living room when her phone suddenly began to vibrate on the coffee table. The caller identification displayed Julian's name. Maya flinched, her breathing instantly turning shallow. I reached over, placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, and handed her a yellow legal pad. On it, I had written a very precise script. I gave her a firm nod, signaling her to answer and place the device on speakerphone. The moment the line connected, Julian launched into a pathetic, carefully rehearsed performance. His voice cracked with fake tears. He begged Maya for her forgiveness, playing the ultimate victim. He swore he had no idea what the documents really meant, crying that his parents had threatened to completely disown him and cut him off from the family accounts if he did not comply. He pleaded for her pity, whispering that he just wanted his wife back and that they could run away together once the paperwork was handled. It took every ounce of willpower Maya possessed not to scream at him. I watched her knuckles turn white as she gripped the edge of the sofa, but she looked at the evidence of his past victims spread across my desk, and her disgust overrode her fear. She took a deep breath, perfectly suppressing her revulsion. Her voice was steady, projecting an impressive illusion of exhausted resignation. "Julian, I understand," Maya said, reading directly from my script. "I am just so tired. I want this nightmare to be over so we can move forward. Tell your parents that Everly and I will meet all of you this Friday at 9 o'clock in the morning. Have the broker present. We will come to his office, and we will finalize all family procedures there." Julian let out a heavy sigh of profound relief, eagerly promising that everything would be perfect. He had no idea that Maya was not surrendering. She was simply confirming the time and location of their execution. On Friday morning at exactly 9 o'clock, Maya and I stepped off the elevator onto the 45th floor of a sleek commercial high-rise in downtown Dallas. The lobby of the brokerage firm was designed to project an image of untouchable wealth, but to my trained eye, it screamed of desperation. The marble floors were imitation. The abstract art on the walls was mass-produced, and the air in the suite was thick with the suffocating scent of cheap, overpowering cologne mixed with the metallic tang of pure greed. We were escorted into a glass-walled conference room overlooking the sprawling city below. A few minutes later, the door swung open, and the parasites arrived. Arthur and Eleanor strode into the room, radiating a sickening aura of absolute triumph. They looked like conquering monarchs returning from a successful siege. Eleanor practically floated, wearing a violently bright designer suit, her lips painted into a razor-thin, patronizing smile. Arthur swaggered behind her, adjusting his silk tie with the smug satisfaction of a man who believed he had just legally stolen a 50-acre estate. Julian trailed in last, refusing to look at his wife. He simply slouched into a leather chair in the corner, looking like a weak, spineless shadow. They treated us exactly as they viewed us, like foolish, emotional women who had finally recognized their proper place in the world and surrendered to their betters. "So glad you girls decided to be reasonable," Eleanor cooed, taking a seat directly across from me. She reached across the table and patted Maya's hand with a condescending sweetness that made my stomach turn. "Family must always stick together through difficult times. You are doing the right thing for your husband, dear." Maya did not flinch. She simply withdrew her hand and stared blankly at the wall, playing the role of the defeated, broken wife to absolute perfection. The shady broker sat at the head of the long glass table. He was a heavily perspiring man with darting eyes, acting entirely too eager to close a deal of this magnitude. He quickly slid a thick stack of finalized loan agreements and power of attorney declarations across the polished glass, right toward Maya and me. He tapped his thick finger rapidly against the bottom margin of the first page. "All right, ladies, let us get this moving," the broker urged, his voice oily and rushed. "I need your initials on pages 4, 7, and 12, and your full legal signatures on the final page. Once the ink dries, the capital transfer will be initiated, and all your family troubles will disappear." Arthur leaned forward, drumming his fingers on the table. "Hurry up," he ordered, dropping all pretense of politeness. "We have a celebratory lunch booked for noon, and I do not want to be late." I did not reach for the pen. Instead, I reached into my tailored jacket pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I set it face up on the glass table, squarely between us, and deliberately tapped the screen to open the voice memo application. A bright red digital counter began ticking the seconds upward. The broker frowned, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "What are you doing?" "No electronic devices are permitted during the signing process." I ignored him completely. I locked my eyes directly onto Arthur's arrogant face. "Before we execute a contract that uses my private estate to underwrite your corporate debt, I have a few final questions for the official record," I said, my voice echoing coldly in the glass room. I spoke with the meticulous, sterile precision of a prosecuting attorney. "Mr. Arthur, do you guarantee these financial reports are completely transparent? Are you stating on the record that your corporations hold the necessary liquid assets to service this debt without defaulting?" Arthur scoffed, rolling his eyes as if he were dealing with a slow child. He leaned closer to the phone. "Yes, I guarantee it. The companies are entirely solvent. Now sign the paper." I turned my gaze to his wife. "Mrs. Eleanor," I continued, my tone unwavering, "do you confirm Maya is signing this document entirely voluntarily, without any coercion, blackmail, or threats of federal prosecution?" Eleanor let out a sharp, derisive laugh. "Oh, for heaven's sake. Yes, absolutely. Maya is a devoted wife fulfilling her marital obligations. There are no threats here, only family duty. Are you satisfied with your little interrogation now?" I looked at Julian, but he just stared at his shoes, offering a pathetic, silent nod to the table. They had no idea. With those clear, unapologetic affirmations, they had just hammered the final nails into their own legal coffins. Every word they had just spoken on that recording converted their actions from a messy domestic dispute into a heavily premeditated, aggressively executed conspiracy to commit wire fraud and extortion. The air in the room grew thick with their impatience. Arthur tapped the heavy fountain pen against the glass table, pushing it forcefully toward my hand. I picked up the heavy, gold-plated pen. I slowly pulled the cap off. I lowered my hand, bringing the sharp metal nib down until it hovered just a fraction of an inch above the signature line. The broker held his breath. Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes wide with greedy anticipation. Arthur allowed a sickening grin of victory to spread across his face. And then I stopped. With a sharp, deliberate click, I snapped the cap back onto the pen and tossed it aside. I looked up at them, allowing a genuine, freezing smile to curve my lips. "I think we are done here," I announced. Before any of them could react to the sudden shift in my demeanor, I reached into the leather briefcase resting by my feet. I pulled out a thick, heavy brown folder of my own and pushed it forcefully right into the center of the glass table. I unclasped the brass lock of the thick brown folder. The metallic click echoed sharply in the silent room. I slid my hand inside and withdrew 4 identical, perfectly bound dossiers. With the slow, deliberate motion of a dealer handing out a devastating final hand of cards, I slid 1 copy to Arthur, 1 to Eleanor, 1 to the sweating broker, and 1 to Julian. Arthur stared at the cover for a fraction of a second, his smug grin freezing in place. "What is this nonsense?" he demanded, his voice thick with irritation. He flipped open the cover. The silence that followed was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of an arrogant empire collapsing into dust. The first page was not a letter. It was a highly detailed ledger. It was a printed spreadsheet exposing every single routing number, every hidden wire transfer, and the exact offshore account balances totaling over $12 million located in the Cayman Islands and Cyprus. These were the ghost accounts Arthur believed were buried beneath layers of impenetrable digital armor. I watched the blood completely drain from his face, leaving his skin the color of wet ash. His hands, which had just been drumming the table with supreme confidence, began to shake violently. He flipped to the second page, then the third. His breathing turned ragged. He was staring at the undeniable proof of his massive tax evasion, his shell companies, and the specific names of Julian's previous fiancés, whose families he had systemically bankrupted. "Where did you get this?" Arthur whispered, his voice cracking into a high-pitched wheeze. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a terror so pure it was intoxicating. "These numbers do not exist," Nobody has these numbers. I am a senior data investigator, I replied, my voice steady and cold. I find things that do not exist for a living. Eleanor snatched her copy of the dossier. As her eyes frantically scanned the highlighted paragraphs detailing her direct complicity in the fraudulent transfers, the elegant, patronizing facade she wore completely shattered. The expensive designer handbag resting on her lap slipped and crashed onto the floor, spilling cosmetics and gold-plated pens across the carpet. She let out a guttural, ear-piercing shriek that vibrated against the glass walls. "You little witch!" Eleanor screamed, her face twisting into a mask of pure venom. The sweet, motherly tone was entirely gone, replaced by the vicious screeching of a cornered rat. She slammed her hands onto the glass table, glaring at me with murderous hatred. "You set us up. You invited us into your home and you trapped us. You are trying to destroy this family." "You destroyed yourselves," I stated simply, not breaking eye contact. "I just brought the receipts." At the head of the table, the broker finally understood the catastrophic reality of his situation. He was not underwriting a lucrative private loan. He was sitting in the direct center of a federal crime scene, and his signature was practically wet on the preliminary documents. Blind panic seized him. He gasped for air, his chest heaving, and began frantically scooping up his fraudulent contracts, shoving them carelessly into his leather briefcase. "I have no part in this," the broker stammered, his eyes darting wildly toward the exit. "I am just an independent contractor. I do not know these people." He abandoned his briefcase on the chair, scrambled to his feet, and sprinted toward the heavy glass door of the conference room. He grabbed the stainless steel handle and yanked downward. The handle did not budge. He pulled harder, his shoes slipping on the polished floor, rattling the heavy door with all his panicked strength. "It is locked," the broker yelled, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "The door is locked from the outside. Open the door." He was absolutely right. Before we sat down, I had quietly signaled the building security team, a team managed by a firm my company frequently contracted, to lock down the perimeter of this specific suite. There was no escape for any of them. Amidst the absolute chaos of Eleanor's screaming curses and the broker violently rattling the locked door, Maya calmly stood up. She had spent the last 3 years shrinking herself to fit into their abusive mold, but right now, she stood tall. She did not look at her shrieking mother-in-law. She did not look at the terrified broker. She walked slowly around the glass table and stopped directly in front of Julian. Julian shrank back into his chair, looking up at his wife with pathetic, tear-filled eyes. He opened his mouth to deploy his usual routine of cowardly excuses, but Maya did not give him the opportunity to speak a single word. She reached out and grasped her left ring finger. With a smooth, decisive motion, she slid the heavy diamond engagement ring and the platinum wedding band off her hand. She did not throw them in his face. She simply dropped them. The rings fell through the air and struck the thick stack of fraudulent loan agreements with a sharp, heavy clatter. "I am done," Maya said. Her voice was no longer trembling. It was steady, resonant, and completely free from the psychological shadow that had suffocated her for so long. "You are nothing, Julian." Seeing his son utterly humiliated, his wife screaming like a maniac, and his secret empire entirely exposed, Arthur snapped. The terror in his eyes morphed into the blind, reckless rage of a wild animal backed against a cliff. He realized the only copy of the devastating data he could reach was the master folder resting directly in front of me. "Give me those files," Arthur roared. He kicked his chair backward so hard it crashed into the glass partition behind him. His face was purple with rage, veins bulging in his thick neck. He slammed both of his heavy fists onto the table, the thick glass vibrating under the intense impact, and vaulted forward. He lunged across the wide table directly toward me, his hands reaching violently to grab my throat and snatch the master dossier. Arthur's heavy body slammed into the glass table, sending the fraudulent contracts scattering into the air like dead leaves. His bloodshot eyes were locked onto my throat. his thick fingers curling into claws as he scrambled over the polished surface to reach me. I did not flinch. I did not lean back. I simply looked him dead in the eye, raised my smartphone, and calmly pressed the single, illuminated red button on the screen. Before Arthur could even stretch his arm across the center of the table, the heavy locked glass door of the conference room was violently kicked open. The reinforced hinges shrieked as the door slammed against the interior wall. "Federal agents, nobody move. Keep your hands where we can see them." The booming voice echoed like a thunderclap. Dominic strode into the room, his federal prosecutor badge gleaming against his dark suit. He was flanked by a dozen heavily armed agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. The absolute chaos in the room evaporated into a stunned, breathless silence. Arthur froze, suspended awkwardly halfway across the glass table, his face draining of whatever color it had left. Eleanor's shrieks died in her throat, replaced by a pathetic, high-pitched gasp as she backed away from the tactical vests closing in on her. The shady broker immediately threw himself flat onto the carpet, wrapping his hands over the back of his head and begging for mercy. Two agents stepped forward, grabbed Arthur by his expensive suit jacket, and roughly hauled him off the table. They slammed him against the glass wall, forcing his arms behind his back. "Arthur Sterling, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, extortion, and racketeering," Dominic announced, his voice devoid of any warmth. He turned his steely gaze to Eleanor. "Eleanor Sterling, you are also under arrest for conspiracy and criminal coercion." As the agents read them their rights, Arthur struggled weakly against the glass. He turned his head toward Dominic, his voice trembling with a mixture of disbelief and remaining arrogance. "You cannot do this," Arthur spat, breathing heavily. "My lawyers will tear this apart. You have no jurisdiction over my corporate headquarters. I will shred every document before you even get a warrant." Dominic offered a chilling, triumphant smile. "That is the best part, Arthur," Dominic said softly, stepping closer to the disgraced patriarch. "We do not need to go to your headquarters tomorrow. We are already there, exactly 5 minutes ago, while you were busy trying to steal this young woman's estate. My task force breached the lobby of your main office. Every server, every hard drive, and every filing cabinet is currently being seized by federal authorities, courtesy of the comprehensive digital roadmap provided by Miss Martinez." The final spark of defiance in Arthur's eyes completely died. He sagged against the glass wall, the realization of his total, unrecoverable ruin finally crushing him. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs echoed in the room, the cold steel locked tightly around Arthur's wrists, and seconds later, the exact same sound rang out as Eleanor was restrained. She did not scream anymore. She simply wept, her makeup running down her face in dark, ugly streaks as the agents marched her out of the room. Julian did not try to defend his parents. He did not ask questions. He simply collapsed onto the thick carpet, curling his knees to his chest, and buried his face in his hands. He sobbed uncontrollably, a pathetic, broken man crying in humiliating helplessness as he watched his mother and father being escorted out in disgrace. Maya stood perfectly still, looking down at the man who had promised to love her, feeling absolutely nothing but a profound sense of relief. 6 months later, the justice system delivered its final verdict. Faced with the overwhelming mountain of digital evidence I had compiled, the Sterling family's high-priced lawyers advised them to take a plea deal. They refused, and the jury ultimately found them guilty on all 24 federal charges. Arthur and Eleanor Sterling were each sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. The government seized their remaining assets, liquidating their fake empire entirely to pay restitution to the families they had destroyed. Julian was left utterly penniless, working a minimum wage job and living in a tiny rented room. Maya, however, was thriving. Her divorce was finalized swiftly, and she was awarded full restitution for the $150,000 Julian had stolen from her, plus substantial punitive damages from the estate liquidation. She took that money, completely cut ties with her past, and opened her own independent graphic design studio in downtown Austin. The evening air was warm and fragrant as I sat on the wide porch of my Texas estate, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. Maya sat next to me, her legs tucked under her, laughing brightly at a story about her new clients. She looked radiant, unburdened, and entirely free. I took a slow sip of my aged bourbon, letting the smooth heat settle in my chest. I looked out over the quiet 50 acres of my sanctuary, reflecting on the absolute boundary of family. The parasites had thought they could march into my home, use my blood as a weakness, and strip me of everything I had built. They failed to understand one very sharp truth. They thought they were breaking into a house to take what they wanted, but in reality, they had voluntarily walked into a permanent prison with no doors and no escape. Maya turned to me, her eyes shining with genuine happiness, and raised her crystal glass. I smiled, raising my own. The clear, ringing sound of our glasses clinking together echoed across the porch, officially closing the storm. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Helena Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.